Right, so welcome back to another episode of our podcast. And today I'm joined by Matt Cook from The Shift, and we're going to be talking about intergenerational workforces. So a super interesting one. Matt, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
You are more than welcome. So before we get started, tell our listeners and watchers a little bit more about you and what you do.
Sure. Okay, so I'm Matt. I'm the co-founder of a company culture consultancy, which is an alliterative mouthful, but basically means that we get to spend our time with interesting organizations thinking about how the company culture can either enable people to flourish or can get in the way and create barriers to people reaching their potential. And we do that in a few different ways. Primarily, we think about mindset shifts. So what do we need to learn, grow, what new knowledge, how do we see problems with a new mindset? And culture shifts, how do we think about the systems, processes, and the environment so that we can do that at scale? So that's it. We're The Shift, and we think about mindset shifts and culture shifts.
Fabulous. So the perfect person to talk to about intergenerational workforces. So for those people who don't know what we're talking about when we say that, what exactly does that term mean from your perspective?
Yeah, it's another one of those unnecessarily long words that basically just means with working with people of different ages. Intergenerational, so cross generations. An intergenerational workforce is basically a company, a workforce, an organization where there are multiple generations working together. And the reason that that's particularly interesting now is that for the first time in history, there are 5 generations making up a workforce. Not all the time, because you kind of have to be straddling either fairly old or very young. But we work with an organization who has 6 generations, not necessarily in the workforce, but they work as a housing group with the elderly as customers and clients. And then they also have apprentices. So there are more generations working together than ever before. And that means you have a diverse range of expectations and norms when it comes to how we work together, which can sometimes result in tension.
I suppose the thing I always struggle a little bit with when we're talking about generations is that kind of generalization piece. Because I guess I think about myself, like I'm selfish in that sense. But I'm in my 40s, don't tell anyone. But I would say I'm quite different to a lot of other people that I meet in my 40s. So then when we talk about kind of particular generations and the way that they interact in the workplace, my experience of the workplace is quite different to others. How do you think that works? Because we kind of generalize in terms of how we treat generations. I don't know if I'm just waffling here, but you know what I mean.
So if we think about each generation entered the workforce at a very different time, economically, culturally, sociologically, technologically, and that has all shaped that generation's attitudes when it comes to working, communication, the relationship with work, with meaning. And that definitely is true. And there is you can, to a certain extent, generalize some of those, but that falls down when you then are thinking about an individual, because any individual person will vary in some of those attitudes with some of those perspectives. So whilst we never want to broad brush and generalize, it is useful to acknowledge the kind of context through which each generation is operating and maybe how that shaped their norms and expectations, while still being really flexible, empathetic, and open to the individual that you're actually talking to.
I think you touched on it a little bit earlier. So are there any kind of myths or misconceptions around kind of tension that's linked to intergenerational workforces?
Yes, definitely. And I'm going to find a quote because I'm going to put it back on you and I'm going to play a little game. Okay, so can you tell me which generation you think said this quote? Our youth now love luxury. They have bad manners, contempt for authority. They show disrespect for elders. They love to chatter instead of exercise. They no longer rise when elders enter the room. They contradict their parents, chatter before company, gobble up their food, and tyrannize their teachers.
I would say, and apologies, Mum, but I'd probably say my mum's generation. So my mum, I hope she didn't mind me telling the world, but my mum is one in the late 70s.
Okay, so probably would fall into the kind of classic boomer category.
Yeah.
And I would have said the same thing the first time I heard it. And I was being a little bit unfair. It's from 2,400 years ago in ancient Greece. And the reason that I love that as an example is every generation, seemingly throughout history, thinks that the younger generations are lazier, ruder, and have no respect for authority. And the reason I think it's interesting, you kind of were talking about tensions or maybe myths about the tensions. And I'd say one of them is that younger generations are lazier, have no respect. And I think it's useful to just remind ourselves that clearly for at least 2,400 years, when I think Socrates was writing in ancient Greece, humans have been having the same thoughts about younger generations. So maybe it's not true. Maybe the stereotype isn't as true as we think it is. And there's some other kind of myths that I think are worth recognizing. So I mentioned around kind of millennials or Gen Zs being lazy or entitled. Most of the research actually finds there isn't much difference between generations when it comes to work ethic. However, the thing that has shifted is the context in which we are all working. So older generations, the economic climate in which they were working, they were able to buy a house, support a family on a single income. That's now not the case for many younger generations. Unfortunately, that gets played out as the classic, if you just stopped having avocado toast, you could afford a house type headline. And I think journalists are really often to blame for a lot of these bad stereotypes that creates the tensions between the generations, because a lot of the evidence shows that there's more similarity between them. That's not to say that it's all the same. I kind of talked about there will be differences in expectations and norms and communication preferences, but generally most generations have more in common. And certainly the myth of the lazy or entitled younger generations just isn't true. Or if it is true, it's been this case for 2,000 plus years.
So why are we consistently thinking that younger people are lazier? I suppose in my head, I'm thinking, is that a change in the working environment? So that systems that we have now are maybe make things easier, but what are your thoughts?
So I think it comes down to, much of the research seems to suggest it actually is more about life stage than birth cohort. So as you are at a certain life stage, you share similar needs, desires, or your preferences change. So I think that is impacting certain older generations' perspectives on younger generations. I do think also that the change in technology has changed how work is perceived to be created, or if we think about kind of value of work, that actually you can create the same amount of value in 1 hour as you maybe could when you were working more analog. And actually that, you think about the word completely escapes me, but presenteeism, the idea that just because you're sat at your desk, it doesn't mean you're actually doing any work. And I think that technology has shifted so that it's not so clear where the value is when it comes to work. So older generations maybe are looking for the cue points they used to reference. Is the person at work? Are they showing up at 9 o'clock? To determine if that person is ambitious. And I just think it's shifted. I think ambition has shifted. And I think that the value is more invisible now.
Are there any kind of unique strengths that you would say each of the generations bring to the workplace?
Yeah, I think part of me thinks that it's largely down to, like I mentioned, life stage, but also the technology plays a huge role in this. So older generations, baby boomers, are going to have more institutional wisdom and experience. If you're at a company for longer, and typically they stayed at a certain company, they have a lot of experience. They know things that have happened. They can draw on that wisdom, which is going to be a huge strength. Not only that, but that experience and wisdom often translate to confidence, which is great, that they are more confident in their abilities or within that company, because they have the experience. On the reverse, on the other side, kind of with Gen Zs, you obviously have more digital natives. So they are more technologically savvy. So they're going to bring a lot more knowledge around how to use AI, how to use evolving technologies to the workplace than maybe baby boomers would naturally. Not to say that baby boomers can't get on board and grapple with it. And I'm sure there are many in that generation that have blogs about this. So again, we're not trying to generalize, but typically Gen Zs have grown up with technology, whereas baby boomers have had to adopt it. So it's slightly different. One of the interesting thing that plays out between that is if you think about power in an organization, often traditional power resided with those in positions of hierarchy or authority. And that tends to happen as you get older. So people that are in older generations have more formal power. They have a certain title that grants them an amount of power. That is slightly being upended by younger generations having more knowledge about the digital world, which is for many organizations where most of the value nowadays is being created. So you have people in positions of authority with formal power, in certain situations having less power than the intern that is running their social media and or is setting up their CRM or is using Google ads to completely change their marketing. And that can create a tension because whilst the intern has informal power in that situation, they don't actually have power to make changes, to get things done. So that can either create a tension, or when it works harmoniously, you get the people in positions of power and authority enabling, empowering the people with the informal power around knowledge, and you get a really nice working relationship. So there are definite strengths that can be used. It's not just tensions. There are ways to work harmoniously with the different strengths. I honestly think the main friction point is believing the stereotypes, which is really hard when I've just talked about there are some clear differences in attitudes. But I guess what I mean by believing the stereotypes is believing the kind of clickbaity headline stereotypes about generations. Things like millennials are entitled and lazy, or baby boomers, you can't teach an old dog new tricks, that type of thing. I think that is probably the biggest friction point, is getting drawn into those labels and myths and not seeing the human that you're talking to. With that being said, there are, I think, two real friction points. The first one is kind of related maybe to the stereotypes, is a lack of contextual understanding. So what I mean by that is different generations often fail to appreciate the structural contexts shaping their attitudes and decisions. So, for example, I mentioned how you get articles like avocado toast and house buying, and the failure to go a step further and ask why aren't younger generations buying houses in the same way that we did, and understanding that the context economically is just so different for this generation. So I think one of the biggest friction points related to believing the stereotypes is kind of ignorance or a lack of understanding around the context that is forming that generational attitude. I think there's probably another one, which is around communication. We do see that communication styles differ quite dramatically from generation. Older generations are used to picking up the phone, just being more direct. With the younger generations, you can't get them on the phone for love nor money. And if it starts to ring, they think something has gone awfully wrong. You pick up the phone and go, "Oh, what's up?" And like, "No, just calling." So there's definitely a change in communication preferences. We've actually seen that since the pandemic. There is a decline in soft skills for younger generations that is going to cause quite an issue. It's already causing issues in organizations. And that's going to cause more tension and friction, not only because the generations are not going to be communicating effectively with each other, but also there is something to be said for being able to pick up the phone when you need to and get someone on the end of it, rather than sending 5 emails and avoiding that difficult conversation. And unfortunately, because of the pandemic, Many younger generations just haven't had that socialization, and the impact of that with some of the clients we're chatting with is actually a loss in revenue, not winning that contract, not retaining that business. So yeah, it's starting to have an impact beyond just culture.
That communication part really resonates with me. So I've got 2 19-year-old twins. Yeah, they prefer evil things like Snapchat. If I try and send them a message on WhatsApp, if I try and call them, they're fine. But they prefer Snapchat and things that disappear. Whereas I'm older, I forget. I don't know what I messaged you about. So yeah, it's interesting because I mean, I jest, but actually that does spill into the life environment, and how do people manage that? So I suppose that's my follow-up question. As kind of leaders and managers, so we know there's these intergenerational differences. What does good look like when we're trying to manage this workforce that's quite different and varied?
At the risk of sounding trite and cliched, so you'll have to forgive me, it really does start with empathy. Emotional intelligence, I think, is a crucial one. I talked about seeing the human, not the stereotype. But I think a large part of that is, in order to have empathy, you have to have understanding and awareness of the cultural context shaping that person. So it isn't to say that, oh, okay, we don't need to think about generations, because I think you absolutely do. I do think it tells us something important about the norms and expectations that that person has grown up with and therefore may have. So I think you need definitely large dose of healthy emotional intelligence to be able to understand the cultural context and the person you're chatting with, to not see, okay, that's a boomer. You've probably, the classic okay boomer meme that went viral, which is has a truth to it at the heart of it, and is also incredibly dismissive and rude. And I can see both sides. So how do you get beyond that? So I think that's the first part, is EQ, and the other part is probably AQ. So we talked about emotional intelligence. This would be adaptability. So AQ would be your adaptability quotient. I think leaders need to, now more than ever, develop their ability to be adaptable, not only because we've talked about the changing technological factors impacting generations, but technology is just changing at an ever-increasing rate. The world is changing at an ever-increasing rate. We're in the age of change, and it's going to be people and leaders' ability to adapt that I think is going to see them successful. And therefore, that also just means adapting to who you're talking to, adapting communication preferences, adapting certain styles of communication or of management, of feedback, or whatever it is, depending on who you're talking to.
We'll have a policy, or they're not the policy sake. Is it something that we need to policies around, or is this just something that should be innate in the way that people interact and work with each other?
So I guess I should admit that I'm more on the culture side than HR, so I don't want to make any legal claims here, but my default tends to be that I think, certainly in this regard, you don't want to create too many additional policies around this, or processes are fine, but policies can get your hands tied up. I think it comes down to flexibility. I think fairness is a really interesting word when it comes to this. I go back and forth as to how important fairness is. And what I mean by that is the sentiment of fairness, absolutely. But people need different things at different stages in their life. And if we end up creating certain policies around, well, this person gets that, so therefore everyone gets this, then actually we're not really seeing the human. We're not seeing that, okay, younger generations have a greater need for probably social connection and collaboration. They probably want to be around teams more. They probably need to learn more in person. They may need more social events than older generations who maybe have families that don't want that as much or can't due to caring responsibilities. So I think the flexibility is a really important part here. And yeah, I guess I'd put it back to you as definitely the expert in HR. How do you balance flexibility and fairness when it comes to then policies around this?
think you were making the point earlier around kind of just awareness and like awareness of people's different experiences of the world that are kind of linked to the generation that they're in. I think that's probably the key thing. Because if you spend a lot of time writing specific policies and that kind of thing, that probably isn't going to work. But as you're writing policies, being aware of people's different experiences and how that works within your workplace, I think that makes sense. But I don't think you need like a specific intergenerational workplace policy. Otherwise, you end up with policies before. And I think it's just an education piece, right? And people being aware, leaders in particular, being aware of the kind of companies that they work for, the types of people that work for them, and how to engage and communicate and all of that really good stuff. Yeah, that's probably my HR answer.
That makes sense. Yeah. And I think about principles maybe over policies for some of this. So whilst I said it's important to be flexible and to adapt communication styles, I don't think that means you have to, as an organization, be everything to everyone. I think that you can say, this is our team's culture and how we communicate. And maybe you would get input on that, so you're not just dictating it. But I think it's okay to say, if I'm sending you a Slack message, it's not urgent. So you don't have to look at it straight away. But if I call you, it is going to be urgent. So would love for you to pick it up. If I email you, I'm kind of expecting maybe you to get back in a couple of hours. So maybe you set some principles around communication. You maybe set some principles around feedback, which might be feedback is direct and honest and growth orientated. But you may flex how you deliver it. You may have someone that prefers to receive it in writing first so they can digest it and then have the conversation. I personally would prefer to have it in person at that time. So I think you want to be flexible and maybe still have some cultural principles that you adhere to. Your values are going to be a super important part of the way you live this. And my hope is that if that's done well, you don't need the policies around this anyway.
I think that. Which I really understand. In particular, communication piece. No one does that. No one sets the boundaries. And I've personally been in so many scenarios where my Slack's going off, my emails are going off, my Teams are going off, my phone's going off, and I've no idea how to understand what to prioritize. And you're flexing your communication stuff. It's just stressful. I think it's so important to keep the advice that you know. Definitely.
Totally. And we're going to go off topic, but I'm going to talk about a bugbear of mine because you've opened Pandora's box. When people send, and again, this is my communication preference, so here we go. When people send a Slack or a Teams message, because it seems like it's instant messaging. That's what it's called, right? Instant messaging. So they'll send like a hey, and that's it. And I'm working and I'm like, okay, I know there's more. I know there's probably an ask at the end of this, but I now have to stop what I'm doing and go, hey, and they go, and then they send the actual message, which is, do you mind sending me that report or whatever it is? And I think it goes back to the confusion around communication preferences, but also there's the word like asynchronous or synchronous. Like, is it actual instant messaging? Or should we treat that more like an email so that I can send you, Trish, the full thing? You can see it. You can choose, do I need to get onto this right away? Or can I wait till later? So that's a personal bugbear, but one that we often share with organizations, because when I share that, other people are like, oh my God, absolutely. I hate receiving a, hey, how are you? And then nothing. It's like, that's nice. I want to connect, but also I know that there's something else coming.
It's the instant messaging because it just conditions you. So, okay, well, you need a response.
Yeah, that's urgent. That's important. Yeah.
Cool. All right. So we've talked about lots of really useful and insightful information. So thank you so much for all that. Is there any examples that you can give from organizations that you've worked with, or maybe case studies of where this has worked well so that people have got that kind of practical kind of feel for what we're talking about?
The first thing that just spoke to mind is, have you seen, I think it's a Channel 4 show, Old People and 4-Year-Olds? It's like something to do with like 4-year-olds, like the secret lives of 4-year-olds, or it's to do with old people and 4-year-olds. I'm getting a blank look, so no, this sounds crazy. But I think it's old people's homes and 4-year-olds, something like that. And they pair up 4-year-olds who go into old people's homes. And there's just such a joy of watching these children just completely change the energy of not only the room, but how the old people see themselves. There's a lovely example where there's kind of a curmudgeonly older man who doesn't really move much. He's always got a stick. At the start, he's kind of like, well, I can't really see the point in this. And then the transformation in him, where he's now walking without a stick and he's like spry and sprightly. And the reason that sprang to mind is the idea of kind of like reverse mentoring. That when we think about mentoring, we often think about what can younger generations learn from older generations. But there's a lot happening at the moment around reverse mentoring. So what can older generations learn from younger generations? So making that relationship rather than kind of a one-way flow, but more two-way, which not only I think is useful for older generations, but also I think it activates a curiosity that isn't necessarily there in a traditional mentoring relationship. We're working with a number of organizations, and we often kind of suggest like reverse mentoring as a great way to support intergenerational working, to build relationships, but just to make that kind of flow of learning go both ways. There's quite a number of other organizations have done it. Famously, there's like IBM have done reverse mentoring. When I was researching this recently, I came across an interesting example of kind of intergenerational working at Michigan Tech University, and they'd invented a new cheapest way to 3D print metal, and they talk about the success came from their multi-generational team, that they had technical deep domain knowledge from older Gen Z people. They had kind of software knowledge from millennials. They had experience from boomers. And I just thought it was a really cool example and acknowledgement from that innovation that, we credit this to the fact that we have a really diverse age range and the different strengths that brings. So yeah, I'd probably say kind of we're seeing reverse mentoring as a really useful way to support intergenerational working. And I mentioned kind of the housing group that we work with. They have not only a large range of generations in the workforce, but because they are a housing group, the people that are living in their homes are, of course, from every single generation. And we've been working with them around the power of storytelling, how the leaders can tell stories in the organization of the work that they're doing, the impact that they're having. And stories are a great way as well to kind of bridge the gap, I think, between the generations, and to tell these types of stories, to break down the stereotypes and tell the types of stories that I just shared from Michigan Tech.
Fun. So we're probably coming towards the end of our time. Sucks because I really enjoyed it. There was one tip that you would give to kind of leaders that are working within intergenerational workforces. What would you tell them to do that will make a bit of a difference?
It comes back to the principle of kind of seeing the person, not the stereotype. And that's maybe the more soundbite catchphrase part. But I think within that is, in order to do that, that means you have to develop your emotional intelligence. You have to develop your understanding for that generation's social, economic, cultural context. So for older generations, what was it like when they entered the workforce? What was the world like? Why do they have certain attitudes? And right the way down to younger generations, how is it? So, what is making it difficult for them with work? If you think about rent, if you think about all of that. So yeah, I think the soundbite is kind of see the person, not the stereotype, but not to be blind to the differences in generational attitudes.
So look, thank you so much for your time. If people want to get hold of you and use your brain, what's the best way to get hold of you?
They can find me on LinkedIn as Matthew Cook. It will be all lowercase. That's probably one of the ways to identify that it's me. Also, the shift.company on the website. And just drop me an email, matthew@theshift.company. I love these kind of chats. So if anyone wants to have another one, I'm all ears and occasionally mouth.
Thank you so much.